The morning her father called to say she needed to come home, Petra was in the middle of a 12-hour shift at Vancouver General. She almost didn't answer. Her phone buzzed twice against the bench in the staff locker room, and when she glanced at the screen and saw Dad, she felt that familiar tightening in her chest, the one that had lived there since she was 17, ever since she'd learned that her father's phone calls never meant good news. They meant someone needed something. They meant she was about to be asked to give up something else. She let it ring through once, then called him back on her break. "Your grandfather's estate," he said, before she'd even finished saying hello. "There are decisions being made. You need to be here, Petra." "Dad, I have 4 more hours on shift, and then I'm back in at 6 tomorrow morning." "Petra." His voice dropped to that particular register she'd grown up fearing. "Never loud. Just final. I'm not asking." She drove the 7 hours to Kelowna the following Saturday, her scrubs still balled up in a bag on the back seat, a coffee going cold in the cup holder. The Okanagan Valley opened up around her the way it always did, pale hills stretching wide, the lake glinting in the distance, the orchards just starting to wake up after winter. She felt the specific grief of someone returning to a place they used to love, before it got complicated. Her grandfather, Raymond Ellsworth, had died 3 weeks earlier, quietly, in his sleep, in the house he'd built on 12 acres outside town. He was 81. As far as Petra was concerned, he'd been the only person in her family who ever looked at her and saw exactly who she was, without trying to reshape her into someone more convenient. He'd also, apparently, left something behind in his will that her father wasn't willing to explain over the phone. The house smelled like cedar and old books when she arrived. Her mother, Diane, met her at the door with a hug that lasted a beat too long, the kind that telegraphs an apology before any words do. "Your father's in the study," she said. "Of course he is." Her father, Gordon, stood behind the desk that used to be her grandfather's. He looked older than she remembered from Christmas. 2 other people were in the room, the family lawyer, a woman named Teresa, whom Petra vaguely recognized, and a man she didn't know at all, sitting in the wingback chair by the window, his back half-turned. When he shifted to look at her, she noticed the cane resting against the armrest. Then she saw his face, early 30s, she guessed, sharp-featured, with the careful stillness of someone very used to being looked at and very much wishing he weren't. "Petra," her father said. "This is Wyatt Calloway." She waited for more. Nothing came. "Okay," she said carefully. "Hi." Wyatt gave her a brief nod. He didn't smile. He also didn't look away, which she found strangely unsettling. His eyes were dark and very steady. "Sit down," Gordon said. "Teresa's going to walk us through the terms of the will." What Teresa walked them through, in the calm, measured tone of someone who had clearly delivered stranger news before, was this: Raymond Ellsworth had left the estate, the house, the 12 acres, the orchard, not to Gordon, as everyone had assumed, but to Petra. On one condition. She had to be married within 60 days of the reading of the will, or the entire estate would pass to a conservation trust. Petra stared at the document Teresa slid across the desk. Then at her father. Then at the man in the wingback chair. "No," she said. "Dad, no, absolutely not. She stopped, tried again. "Why would Grandpa do this?" Gordon's jaw tightened. He had his reasons. What reasons? What possible? He felt, Teresa said, with the diplomatic smoothness of someone steering a car away from a ditch, that you had been, in his words, too focused on surviving to remember how to live. He wanted to give you a reason to stop. Petra went quiet. She thought about the last conversation she'd had with her grandfather, 6 months before he died. She'd driven up for his birthday, and they'd sat on the porch after dinner, watching the light fade over the lake, when he'd asked her out of nowhere if she was happy. She'd said yes automatically, and he'd looked at her with those gray eyes, the particular Raymond Ellsworth look that always meant "I know you better than that." He hadn't pushed. He'd just reached over and patted her hand. She hadn't cried until she was back on the highway, heading south. "Who is he?" she asked, nodding toward Wyatt. "He's the son of my business partner," Gordon said. "Harlan Calloway." "You've met Harlan." Vaguely. A tall man with a booming voice who showed up at her parents' Christmas party some years. So this is what, a business arrangement? It doesn't have to be complicated, Petra. She kept her voice level. I'm a nurse. I work 60 hours a week. I have a lease in Vancouver that runs until September. I have a life. You have a career, Gordon said. There's a difference. She wanted to throw something. She didn't. Instead, she turned to Wyatt Calloway, who hadn't said a single word through the entire conversation. What do you get out of this? She asked him directly. He turned. Those steady eyes again. Nothing I'm willing to explain in this room, he said. It was the most honest thing anyone had said since she'd walked in. She didn't agree that night. She drove to her parents' house, slept in her childhood bedroom, and lay awake on a mattress that still had the same faded blue duvet she'd had at 16, staring at the ceiling, trying to find a version of the situation that made any kind of sense. Her grandfather had loved her, she knew that. She also knew that Raymond Ellsworth had been, in his quiet way, a man who did things for reasons. He didn't make gestures without intention. He'd built everything he had from scratch, given her father a comfortable life Gordon had somehow never quite managed to feel grateful for, and spent the last years of his own life watching Petra move through the world like someone who'd forgotten she was allowed to want things. She thought about what Teresa had read from the Will, too focused on surviving to remember how to live, and hated how much it landed. In the morning, she called her supervisor and arranged coverage for the following week. Then she texted Teresa and said she wanted to talk to Wyatt Calloway alone before making any decision. They met at a coffee shop on the edge of town, the kind with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls. He was already there when she arrived, his cane hooked over the back of his chair, both hands wrapped around a mug. He looked different outside the study, less formal, more tired. You didn't have to do this the way my father wanted, she said, sitting down. You could have said no. So could you. I'm considering it. I know. He didn't seem bothered by that. She ordered a tea she didn't particularly want and studied him. Up close, she noticed a faint scar along his left jawline, the kind that had clearly once been significant and had faded, over time, to something almost invisible. What happened, she asked, before she decided to. He glanced at her, then, to her surprise, answered plainly. Skiing accident. 7 years ago. Spinal injury. I can walk with the cane on good days. On bad days, I use a chair. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's just information. She liked that, actually, the plainness of it. Most people either performed discomfort or overcorrected into a kind of forced ease whenever disability came up. He just stated it, like he was giving her the weather. Why does your father want this? She asked. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. My father and your grandfather had a partnership that wasn't uncomplicated. There are business interests tied to the Ellsworth estate. My father wants them managed by someone who'll be cooperative. And you're supposed to be the cooperative mechanism? He looked at her steadily. I'm here having coffee with a stranger instead of sitting in my office in Calgary. I suppose that's a kind of cooperation. She almost smiled. Almost. I'm not going to quit nursing, she said. I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not. And I want to understand, clearly, what this arrangement actually is, what we're each getting, what we're each giving up. No vagueness. He nodded slowly. That seems fair. Okay, she said, and heard herself add, without quite planning to, then I'll think about it. The wedding was small. City Hall in Kelowna, a Tuesday in April, gray sky pressing low over the mountains. Her mother cried. Her father stood very straight, looking like a man who'd gotten exactly what he wanted and wasn't sure how to feel about it. Wyatt wore a dark suit. Petra wore a dress she'd bought off the rack at a boutique on Bernard Avenue, because she'd refused to spend a week hunting for something that would feel like it meant more than it did. She'd called her best friend, Sorka, the night before. Sorka, also a nurse, had known Petra since they were both 19-year-old students sharing a flat in Victoria, and had the particular gift of being able to say, "Are you out of your mind, and I'm coming to get you if you need me," in the exact same breath. "Tell me this is what you want," Sorka said. "I don't know what it is yet," Petra said honestly. "But I'm doing it." "Okay. Then I'm in your corner." "But Petra, the second it stops feeling right, you call me." "I know. Promise me." "I promise." She felt calmer after that. Not certain calm, there was a difference, one she'd learned to appreciate over years of working in emergency medicine. Certainty was a luxury. Calm was something you could actually use. The estate was hers on paper by the end of that day. 3 weeks after the wedding, Wyatt drove up from Calgary with 2 boxes and a dog, a large, grey-muzzled shepherd mix named Birch, who immediately set about investigating every corner of the property with the thoroughness of a building inspector. Petra had driven back from Vancouver the day before, her own car loaded with the things she'd decided she couldn't live without, and the half-formed plan of taking this one season at a time. She'd transferred to the Kelowna General float pool. Not Vancouver General, but it was work, and it was hers, and she'd fought too hard to build her competence in a hospital room to abandon it for a house, no matter how much she loved that house. They were polite with each other, those first weeks. Careful. Petra learned that Wyatt made coffee early, and always made enough for 2, which she found she appreciated even before she admitted it to herself. He worked remotely, something in commercial real estate development, and kept his office door mostly closed. Birch claimed the rug in front of the fireplace as sovereign territory and regarded Petra with the slow, regal interest of a creature still deciding whether she was worthy. She started coming home from shifts and sitting on the porch, watching the valley in the last of the light, and realized that for the first time in years, she was actually sitting, not decompressing so she could go back, not resting so she could function, just sitting, the way her grandfather used to. One evening, Wyatt came out with 2 beers and handed her one without asking. "Bad shift," he said. "Long." She looked at the can. "Thank you." He sat in the other chair. Birch came and settled between them. "My grandfather used to do this," she said after a while. "Sit out here after dinner. I used to think it was an old person thing. Like you had to earn it somehow." "Earn what?" "Stillness." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "I used to think I'd earn it once the business hit a certain number. Then once I could walk without the cane more days than not." Then, he paused. It kept moving. The line. "Me too," she said. The complication arrived in July, in the form of a man named Frederick Langham. She'd never met him, but she knew the name. Frederick Langham was the managing director of a development company that had spent 3 years trying to buy part of the Ellsworth property, specifically, the 16 acres beside the orchard that her grandfather had held as agricultural reserve. The conservation trust clause in the will, it turned out, had less to do with Petra's romantic life and much more to do with blocking Frederick Langham. Her grandfather had explained it all in a letter she found in the estate's filing cabinet in late June, tucked inside a folder marked simply, "Read when you're ready." "I know how your father operates," Raymond had written. I know he'd have sold before the ink was dry. I needed it to go to someone with more patience. I'm sorry for the theater of the thing, you always hated theater, but I needed you there, and I needed you to have a reason to stay long enough to understand what you were protecting. The land matters, Petra. The orchard matters. Don't let Frederick take it. And while you're at it, stop running. You're very good at it. It doesn't suit you. Asterisk. She read it twice, then folded it and put it back. She told Wyatt that evening. He listened without interrupting, a quality of his she'd come to recognize, the ability to actually hold space for what was being said instead of preparing his response while she was still talking. Langham's been in contact with my father, he said, when she'd finished. She looked at him. Recently? Before all of this. My father had interest in the project. I didn't know the full scope until about a month ago. What changed a month ago? I started reading the actual documents. He was quiet a moment. And it's not something I want to be part of. He held her gaze. Which my father isn't particularly happy about. Is that why you agreed to this? To stop your father from dealing with Langham through the estate? Partly. A pause. And partly because your grandfather asked me to. She went very still. He wrote to me 6 months before he died, Wyatt said. I'd met him twice, years ago, through my father. He reached out, said he had a granddaughter who'd forgotten how to stop moving, and a property that needed someone steady, and asked if I'd consider being part of the solution. He looked down at the table. I thought it was a strange thing to ask. Then I thought about my own life, and I said yes. Petra didn't know what to do with that. It was too much to sit with all at once, so she did the thing she'd been learning all spring, she let it settle, without grabbing for it. Okay, she said finally. Then we deal with Langham. We deal with Langham, he agreed. Dealing with Langham turned out to be less dramatic than she'd expected, and more exhausting. It meant 3 meetings with Teresa, a long review of agricultural land reserve regulations, and one deeply unpleasant phone call, in which Frederick Langham explained, in the tone of a man who had never once been told no by anyone he considered relevant, that there were creative ways to structure the sale that the conservation clause wouldn't catch. By that point, Petra had done enough reading to know exactly what he meant. And by that point, she had enough anger to be very calm about it. The land isn't for sale, she said. I don't think you'll find a structure that changes that. But I encourage you to try. She hung up before he could respond. She told Wyatt about it afterward, expecting, she wasn't sure what. Some transactional well done. What she got instead was Wyatt setting down his coffee and starting to laugh, quietly and genuinely, Birch lifting his head off the rug in sleepy inquiry. It was, she realized, the first time she'd heard him actually laugh. Her father came in August. She'd known he would. Gordon Ellsworth didn't simply accept outcomes that contradicted his expectations. He drove up on a Wednesday, unannounced, and stood in his father's kitchen with the expression of a man inventorying everything he'd lost. You're going to hold on to this place, he said. Not a question. Yes. The orchard hasn't turned a profit in 4 years. I know. I'm working on it. Anne Calloway is my husband, she said. And not your concern. Gordon looked at her for a long moment. She'd spent her whole life trying to decode that look, trying to find the version of herself that would finally satisfy whatever it was he needed. She'd given up a lot chasing it, opportunities, relationships, entire chapters of herself packed quietly into boxes and put into storage, because he'd made her feel that what she wanted and what was sensible could never be the same thing. Your grandfather left everything to you, Gordon said finally. Did you know he and I argued about it the last 2 years? No. He said I didn't need it. He said you did. His jaw moved. I didn't understand what he meant. He paused. I think I'm starting to. It wasn't an apology. She didn't think her father had the language for the kind of apology this would actually require. But it was something. A crack in the wall. She'd take it. After he left, she stood on the porch and watched his car disappear down the long gravel drive, and felt something she hadn't expected, not victory, but something quieter, closer to grief and gratitude tangled together, the way things usually were when they were real. Wyatt came out at some point and stood beside her. You okay? He said. Yeah. She watched the dust settle over the driveway. He's not a bad person. He just learned very early that the only way to matter was to take up space, and he passed that down. She paused. I spent a long time running from it. My grandfather was right. I was very good at it. You're not running right now. She looked at him. He was watching the valley, the lake catching the late afternoon light, Birch leaning against his leg. No, she said. I'm not. In September, she made her transfer to Kelowna permanent. She called Sorka to tell her, and Sorka cried a little and said she was already planning to drive up for Thanksgiving, and Petra said she'd make pie, and Sorka said, "You've never made pie in your life," and Petra said, "There's a lot of things I've never done that I'm starting to do." And they both laughed. The orchard had its first profitable weekend at the market stand in October. Small, just 2 tables at the farmer's market in town, apples and late pears and some squash she'd grown almost by accident in the kitchen garden. She made $47 and felt an absurd amount of pride about it. Wyatt drove her home, and she talked the whole way about what she wanted to try next spring, varieties she'd been reading about, whether it was worth bringing someone in to look at the irrigation system. He didn't say much. He listened the way he always did. And at some point she noticed she wasn't performing the conversation, wasn't editing herself for palatability, wasn't measuring how much enthusiasm was appropriate. She was just talking, and he was just there, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world. That night, after dinner, with Birch asleep by the fire, the kitchen warm with the smell of the meal, and the windows gone dark with evening, Wyatt looked up from his book and said, "I'd like to stay." She set down her mug. The arrangement was 60 days, and then open-ended, he said. "I want to be clear, I'm not assuming anything. He paused. I'd like to stay. If that's something you'd want." She thought about her grandfather, sitting on this same porch for all those years, watching the lake, having built everything around him from nothing and chosen not to run from any of it. She thought about a Tuesday in April, a city hall, a dress off the rack, and the particular feeling of stepping towards something with no map. She thought about how long she'd kept moving the line. "Yeah," she said. "I'd like that too." Outside, the valley was dark and quiet and very wide, and the orchard stood in it, hers, held, not given away. And somewhere in the distance, the lake was doing what it always did, simply existing, patient and enormous, entirely unbothered by the small human decisions being made along its shore.